Hey, I'm Kristine Foley. I am an environmental health engineer with the Vermont Department of Health Private Drinking Water Program. I'm going to share with you the results of a recent survey we did of folks who tested their water with our health department lab, asking some questions about what they tested for, why they tested, and getting some information on treatment behaviors. So Vermont Department of Health, we just have one statewide health department. We don't have any county level health departments, and we have a really phenomenal statewide health department lab that handles most of the water tests in the state. Our legislature passed a law a few years back saying that any certified drinking water lab that is certified to run samples in Vermont or for Vermont has to give us all of their test results. So we know what people test for, and we know what contamination is in their test. But we don't know a lot of things around it. We don't know why people test. We don't know if they understand their results. We don't know if they install treatment, and we don't know if they have any barriers to installing treatment. So those were some of the goals of this survey. We worked alongside our colleagues in the Health Statistics and Information Group at Environmental Health. We have a phenomenal communication department that we worked with, and we have some great colleagues at our lab that we worked with to develop this survey. The survey was sent to anybody who had submitted water samples to our lab, so any private well users who had submitted water samples to our lab in the 5-year period ending on November 1st, 2023. That represented around 3,600 email addresses, so they had to have an email address attached to their sample submission. The survey was open for 24 weeks from the spring of 2024 until the fall of 2024. We got a little over 600 responses, so 18% response rate, and just over half of those were complete responses. So the survey kind of was designed to follow what our ideal testing scenario is, where you test your water, you get your results, you interpret them, you determine if you have contamination, you address and treat it, and then you retest it. We also asked a few questions about barriers to treatment, so if you had contamination but didn't treat it, and some background and demographic information. So, background information. Vermont is a pretty rural state, pretty small. We have just under 700,000 people in the state, and like most of you all, we don't know how many wells there are, but we estimate between 30 and 50% of the state uses private drinking water, depending on what estimation system you use. So in this survey, we found that overwhelmingly the majority of folks use their private water for consumptive use. 95% of them use it all the time for drinking and eating and cooking. 3% use it sometimes. 2% did not. When we looked at those responses, that seemed more like a moment in time situation as opposed to a static state, how their typical water use is. We also asked what treatment installations did folks have before they tested. Overwhelmingly, they were gone and then they're back. It was led by sediment filters and water softeners. Those two together accounted for around 2/3 of all the treatment systems. They're great systems, but in Vermont, they typically are associated with aesthetic concerns rather than health concerns. So the first step is to test. In Vermont, we recommend testing for bacteria every year, and we recommend testing for what we call the Vermont Homeowners Testing Kit every 5 years. It does bacteria. It does the other 10 most common contaminants in the state, so it's a set of selected inorganics and gross alpha. And because you're gonna ask, it's $159 at the Vermont Department of Health lab. We asked about testing drivers, what folks tested for, why they tested for it, over 7 questions. Some were yes, no, I don't know. Some were multiple choice, select all, and we had write-in responses as well. So when we asked what drove people to test, why they tested, this was a multiple choice, select all, write-in answer. We had almost 800 responses for why people tested. So people test their water in Vermont for a lot of reasons. When we drilled it down into these 7 kind of meta categories, we saw that health department recommendations were the largest driver for testing, which makes you feel really warm and cozy inside. That includes recommendations from our website, fact sheets, talking to us, that type of thing. The next leading group were water quality concerns, flood concerns, but also things like my neighbor piled a large quantity of manure 30 feet from my well. Definitely a water quality concern. Required testing. In Vermont, we require testing if you are on a private well and you have a daycare, if you do home catering licenses, other things like it was required for an H-2A workers residence. Those are temporary farm workers. Health concerns being having a pregnant person in the house, having a young child in the house, having elderly people in the house, also a lot of more vague ones like I've had some symptoms I thought might be traceable to something in the water. Real estate transactions were pretty high. Vermont does not require testing with real estate transactions, so those are often tied to, we're thinking, mortgage and lender requirements. No specific reason out of curiosity. Those were all over the board, but it was often things like, I have not tested for 34 years and thought a retest could be good. Yes, it could. And a third-party recommendation came from anybody who wasn't us. So when we looked at what folks tested for in combination with why they tested, we see a lot of differences. And so what we'd like to see on this is the blue bar and the red bar being high. So the blue bar would be bacteria and inorganics together, and then that red maroon is just bacteria only, and those would be following our health protective testing recommendations. And we see those two bars being really high when folks follow our recommendations with water quality concerns and required testing. We see a little more bacteria there. It doesn't surprise me. For some of our required testing, bacteria is the only required test. But we see folks doing really testing that's not health protective when it comes to just being curious. Testing for just inorganics in Vermont is not health protective. So once you test, the next step is to get your results and figure out if you have contamination. Our lab did a big change in our lab results report in the summer of 2023. So we wanted to see if that report change increased clarity. We wanted to see if it increased clarity of folks knowing whether or not they had contamination, and of folks knowing what to do if they indeed had contamination. So we asked a few questions around that. This is what our old report, so pre-July 31st, 2023 looked like if you had a lead contamination or a lead detection. It's all the same font. It's not really clear. So in August, we changed that. We put final result was in bold if you had an exceedance, and we added that interpretation category that says above threshold in those nice, bold, angry letters, so folks will take action. We also added this disclaimer at the top of all of our results reports, a little how to read your results, and hyperlinks to a few of our websites. Most of the folks who test with our lab get their results via email, so having the links in there is really, really nice. It makes it really, really easy for them to figure out where to go. So when we ask those two questions, is it clear that you have contamination, and is it clear where to go for treatment or health information? We saw a 7% increase in both of those from the old results to the new results. So for being clear on contamination, that jumped from 83 to 90%, and being clear on where to go for treatment or health information, that jumped from 73 to 80%. Neither of those are near the 100% that we'd like to see, but it was nice to see an increase. We also asked an open-ended question of what could we do to make our lab reports better? We got 90 responses to this. They were all over the board, but they really fit into these three categories of give us resources, improve clarity and communication, and it was great, or I don't remember because I sampled my water 5 years ago. And a lot of folks who left a comment showed that it was a bit intersectional. So I felt and still feel completely on my own to figure out what to do about my gross alpha radiation. I reached out to one company for help, but never got a response. So they want some resources. We've been buying drinking water since, but don't really know how safe or unsafe our water is. So they want better clarity and communication from us. But ideally, you're in that 90% who knows if your water is contaminated or not. And then your next step is to address or treat it. We asked questions about this. We asked 13 of them. It was by far the bulk of the survey. A lot of them were big, long questions. They were yes, no, unsure. We had multiple choice, select all write-ins. We asked about different contaminants separately. We asked where folks got their treatment advice from. We asked about addressing and treatment separately, acknowledging that there's ways of getting rid of contamination that aren't necessarily installing treatment. So this was definitely the bulk of the survey. So the good news is that testing leads to action. It's kind of what we all want to see all the time. So the table on the left, you'll see that 75% of bacterial contamination was addressed, 44% of inorganic contamination was addressed, and 21% of gross alpha contamination was addressed. You'll take a look at the gross alpha and you'll notice that it's not so much that folks did not address it, they just don't know if they addressed it. And we saw a lot of unsureness around gross alpha. And in other areas of our program, we do see a lot of unsureness around gross alpha. It's a tough contaminant to understand. It's a little tricky to explain to folks, and that kind of persists. We also saw that new treatments happen. There were 90 new treatments that were installed as a result of this testing folks undertook. And when we parse that out, we see that ultraviolet systems were the most common. Water softeners are still up there. We have a lot of hard water in Vermont, and reverse osmosis systems are up there. Big difference is that we now see 2 health protective treatments in the top 3 installations compared to before testing. So that was really, really nice to see. Bacterial contamination is addressed often, it's addressed correctly. So on the table on the left, we see that 80% of folks addressed bacteria, addressed it correctly, and often in long-term ways. So that's shock chlorination, which depending on the source of the bacteria can be long-term. We have a lot of drilled wells in Vermont, so that often works really well for them. Installing treatment, replacing a well cap, and completing system repairs are all great ways of dealing with it that lots of folks chose. When we looked at it a little more in depth, E. coli contamination was a driver for addressing. It was about 10% more likely to be addressed than total coliform bacteria alone. The vast majorities of the installations, treatment installations, were appropriate for bacteria, and a lot of folks got their advice from the Vermont Department of Health, and the folks who did install treatment and got advice from us were 1.5 times more likely to install appropriate treatment than folks who got their advice elsewhere. Inorganics looks a little similar, a little different. Again, the majority of folks who addressed it appropriately. It's not quite 80%, it's more like 60 between installing treatment and completing system repairs, which can be really effective for contaminants like lead. So we wanted to look at if folks treated their contamination appropriately and if they installed treatment appropriately. So this, little confusing, but we're looking at the same data from 2 different directions. So on the left, we're looking at if the contaminants were treated for appropriately. So we've got arsenic, manganese, gross alpha, nitrates, uranium, other, which is a few different ones, iron, and lead. So we see that arsenic and manganese are treated appropriately, just under 70% of the time, dropping down to around 60% of the time for lead. As I said, we wanted to see if the treatment systems were being used appropriately. We see that reverse osmosis was being installed appropriately around 80–85% of the time, which was really great considering it's one of the treatments that folks installed the most as a result of testing. And that drops down quite low with other treatment systems, other filter systems at the end. The orange part of the stacked bar is things that we were unsure about. A lot of that unsureness and unclarity comes from the variety of write-in responses that we had, both for what the contaminant was and for what the treatment system folks installed was. And installing treatment, where you get your advice from really matters. So we asked folks where they got their advice from when they installed treatment. And we found that folks who talked to a plumber, a water treatment specialist, or a well driller installed appropriate treatment around 55% of the time. Folks who just looked at our website or fact sheet installed it around 60% of the time. Folks who searched the internet were installed appropriate treatment around 67% of the time, which is a big win for the internet. And folks who talked to someone from the health department on the phone installed treatment that was appropriate 86% of the time. I want to take a sidebar here because this is a big win for us. My colleague Tom and I, Tom presents tomorrow, we staff the phone line at the Vermont Department of Health Private Drinking Water Program. We get 1,200 calls a year, which means 86% of people listen to us when they talk to us, which is amazing. I have 3 kids. They do not listen to me 86% of the time. So this is really great to see. So after you have treated or addressed your contamination, the next step is to retest it. You need to make sure that your treatment is effective and doing what you want it to be doing. Unfortunately, retesting is not as common as we'd like to see it. On the table on the left, 68% of folks with total coliform who addressed it retested. 65% of folks who addressed their E. coli retested. So E. coli was a driver for addressing contamination. It's no longer a driver for retesting. And just 48% of folks who had inorganic contamination retested after they installed treatment. And when we look at inorganics separately, so the graph on the right, we see that retesting among inorganics is led by arsenic and lead. So 80% of the folks who addressed arsenic retested to make sure that that treatment was effective. Great to see it for arsenic and lead. Those are both big health concerns. We see that drop off to around 50% for nitrate and nitrite, 33% in manganese, and apparently nobody really cares about chloride. Sometimes we have a breakdown in our system. Folks test, they get their results, they see they have some contamination, and then they don't deal with it. So we asked a few questions to figure out what the barriers were, what the breakdown in the system was there. We asked about it 2 questions. We asked, what were your barriers to treatment? And what were you unsure about for treatment? And the goal of these questions was kind of to say, we wanted the barrier question to apply to folks who did not install treatment, and the question about being unsure to speak to the folks who did install treatment but had some stumbling blocks on the way. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way, but we still got some really great data from the questions. Both of these questions were multiple choice, select all, write an option. Each of those questions got well over 400 responses. So just like we saw, folks had lots of reasons for testing. They had lots of things that they wanted different in our lab results reports. They have lots of reasons why they don't install treatment or why they're unsure about treatment. By far the biggest one, when we narrowed it into 4 categories, you can ignore that second technical category on the end. That one shouldn't be there, was health literacy. So really understanding things. It's in this quote right here. It's what I've heard a lot of people say. I've been drinking the water for 40 years and have not had a problem. It tastes and smells good. That's a health literacy issue. We know that that's not the case. And thankfully, this is one of the few barriers that we as the health department have some agency over, and we have the ability to kind of change and work to overcome. The next largest barriers were treatment and technical. We saw a little difference between the two, between whether it was a barrier or helped make you unsure about testing. You kind of see part of that in the second half of this response quote. Testing other than for E. coli is pricey. This is true. Treatment is also pricey. Technical barriers and being unsure about treatment often had to do with older housing in Vermont, alternative systems, that kind of thing. We also looked at, we collected a little bit of data on household income. It was some of the very few demographic data we did collect. And we found there was a break around the $50,000 mark for annual household income. So folks who made less than that, 64% of those folks addressed their bacterial contamination, compared with 81% of folks who made over $50,000 a year. We see a similar large jump, 25 to 55% for addressing inorganics. Gross alpha stayed pretty similar. So, conclusions, what does it all mean? If you were to say, Kristine, what did this survey do? What do you get from 600 responses in a sentence? I would say testing leads to treatment, but why you test and where you get your treatment advice from have really big implications for public health. People have lots and lots of reasons for testing, and why they test matters. When I looked at those 700 responses for drivers for testing, at first I could only get it down to 21 different categories. It took a lot of work to get it into a digestible 7. So there's lots of reasons for why people test, and people often have multiple reasons for testing. And why they test matters. If they're taking health department recommendations, they're doing health protective testing in Vermont. If they're getting recommendations from other places, there might not be. So having our messaging out there and clear is really important. The report changes in our lab reports led to increased clarity, but not enough. Again, we have 90% of folks understanding if they have contamination. It would be great if it was 100. We have 80% of folks understanding what to do about their contamination and where to go. It would be great if that was 100. When it comes to addressing and treating your contamination, bacterial contamination is more likely to be addressed and appropriately treated than inorganic contamination. I was around 70% for addressing bacteria, down to in the 40s for inorganics. So we have lots of room for improvement there, and making sure folks get the correct treatment. Making sure folks install the correct treatment means making sure that they're getting advice from the correct sources and knowledgeable sources. So getting that out there, getting that information out there, and making sure everybody in the community is really well educated. Retesting rates are low across the board, and they have lots of room for growth. So this was something we saw across all contaminants. There's a lot of work we can do there. And that while respondents did want more financial and technical supports, they were not the largest barrier to treatment, although they are substantial barriers. Health literacy was the biggest barrier. It was also one of the things folks wanted, more clarity and communication in our results reports. So that is something that we do have agency over and that we can improve. So those are some of our big takeaways. And some of the lessons that we learned, some of the things that we will take into account next time, is we did not ask about the private water type, so drilled well, dug well, or spring. It would have been really nice to be able to say, oh, the folks who had a technical barrier overwhelmingly were using springs for their sources. So we could kind of target outreach, we could make more materials, we could do more research to help support those private water users. It would also have allowed us to tie this data into some other data sets that we have, because we often ask about the type of private drinking water, the type of source folks have. Our survey design had a lot of complex logic. We had a lot of long questions. It led to some contradictory answers when folks could do a multiple choice select all with a write-in response. So kind of parsing out what the real intention was and what the real answer was a little tricky sometimes. The lack of demographic data, that was a conscious choice when the survey was created. We found that having less demographic data, less personal data collected leads to higher response rates. But it also means that we can't tie the data to locations in Vermont, so we don't know where folks were responding from if we really only talk to folks who tested who were in the typically wealthier areas, or if they were spread out throughout Vermont. Again, Vermont's a rural state. So that, and not knowing how many folks were in each household to tie to our economic data would have also been really nice. Again, that select all and write-in options made some determinations difficult. It just was what it was. And knowing that there were viewpoints we failed to capture. So Vermont is old and it's rural, and having the survey be only done via email discounted a lot of folks who do test with our lab. So there were a lot of viewpoints we missed that might have led to some more nuanced views of barriers to treatment, being unsure about treatment and that kind of thing. So I think I was really fast. And any questions? For the high number of owners with sediment filters, did they also indicate if they'd installed them without testing first? We did not ask about what prompted folks to install the treatment that they had before this round of testing. So, unknown. How was I sure the systems installed were appropriate? Were they certified systems? We did not ask if they were certified systems. We asked so they self-reported their contaminants from a select all list with a write-in option, and then they did the same for their treatment system. So there definitely is wiggle room. I had my water tested, I tested it in November. I do not remember my exact numbers for anything, and I could not remember if it was 5 years ago, Does Vermont certify or license treatment installers? We do not. We recommend folks use a certified water treatment specialist from the Water Quality Association. We do license well drillers, though. That one we do license. What responses to the survey did we find most surprising and most encouraging? Most encouraging was seeing how trusted we are in the community, how many folks want to follow our testing recommendations. You know, I've heard so many questions here today saying folks distrust their state government, so many comments around that and not being let in. And so it was really gratifying to see, that made it even more gratifying to see how trusted the health department is in Vermont. So that was really, really nice. Most surprising, I really thought that the financial barriers would be a bigger barrier to things. I think that might be skewed a little bit because we did survey folks who had already paid, most of them $159. That's by far our most common testing package for testing. So that might have been a little self-selective. The gross alpha is usually coming from uranium or radium. Tom, do you know?
Usually uranium.
Yeah, it's usually uranium for us. There were no incentives for survey participants. This was out of the goodness of their heart. Vermonters, we are a small but mighty state, and yeah, we like to participate in lots of things. Can I remind us what % of private well users in Vermont are using our testing program? Our testing program is not free, so they test with the lab. It's all voluntary, it's all by choice. I do not know what % of private water users are using our testing program. Tom might know that answer. They are supposed to collect samples from their kitchen sink. So folks collect samples themselves. They order a kit from our lab. They pay for it when they order it. Our lab sends it out. It comes with a sheet with color photographs and step-by-step instructions on how to collect a sample. We also have a how-to video on our website on how to collect a sample. They are supposed to remove their aerator and take it from the kitchen sink. We all know from experience that not everybody does that. So ideally, yes, it's from the kitchen sink with the aerator off. Why do I think our department is so well trusted by the private well owner population? Ooh, that's a good one. I started with the public health department in July of this year, so I'm pretty new, but I've lived in Vermont for over 10 years. I have to say, personally, not speaking for the health department, I think our COVID response it just really brought our state together. Our entire state rallied around our now former health commissioner, Mark Levine. I mean, folks made snowmen dressed up like him. He was very beloved for guiding us through that challenge, and I think it just engendered a lot of positive feelings towards the health department overall. Great, thank you. Have a good snack.